stuffing day has got to be one of the best days of the year on this channel. We are going to be celebrating stuffing season today with 3 tasty takes on the classic stuffing. Now, if you're not familiar with how to make classic stuffing, I actually shared a great foolproof recipe on the channel last season. So once you're done watching this yummy video, I highly recommend you take a look for that. For our first tasty take today, I have a wonderfully savory and satisfying mushroom and leek stuffing. This starts with some butter in my pan. You can also do this in a soup pot if you want. You really want something with a lot of volume. Once my butter is melted, I am going to be adding a whole lot of mushrooms. As you can see, I've got a ton of beautiful cremini mushrooms here that I've roughly chopped. I'm also going to be adding some roughly chopped leeks. If you're not super familiar with leeks, they are really, really tasty. They're sort of like onions, but a little milder. They also have great texture. When you're working with leeks, after you've chopped them, it's important that you rinse them really well because sometimes they tend to have a little bit of dirt or sand caught in between the little layers, and you want to get rid of that because, of course, that does not make anything delicious. At this point, we are also going to add some celery. Don't panic if you feel like your pan is overstuffed. Everything's going to shrink down quite a bit. Let's add some salt and some pepper to this while you all recover from my terrible pun game. Once all of that yumminess has shrunk down, you can start building in even more flavor with a little minced garlic and then our classic stuffing herbs. So in this case, I am using sage, which it's just basically not stuffing if you are not adding sage, at least as far as I'm concerned. I'm also adding some fresh thyme leaves, which are so beautiful when mixed with mushrooms. You guys probably see that combination a lot on my channel. I'll let that cook for another minute or so, and then it is time to add my broth. Now I'm using my incredible homemade mushroom broth in this stuffing. Nothing but the best for my stuffing. If you want the recipe, go ahead and check out my 3 homemade broths video. I posted it a few weeks ago. We're going to bring our broth to a simmer and then let this cook for maybe 3 or 4 minutes. You just want to give those flavors a chance to really come together. We are going to finish it off by stirring in just a little bit of freshly chopped parsley. I like doing this at the end of cooking so the parsley maintains a bit of its freshness. Next, I want to talk about the bread I'm using in this recipe. I just took a big, beautiful, crusty French loaf, cut it into cubes, laid it on a baking sheet, and then let it sit in the oven overnight to dry out. There's no need to turn the oven on. You just want to give this a chance to get a bit crusty because the drier your bread, the better it's going to absorb all of that incredibly flavorful broth we have happening in our skillet. If you find things in your pan are a little too dry, you can always add a little more broth at this point. If you find things are too moist, add more bread. That's sort of how it goes. Because we are going to be baking this stuffing in the oven, instead of putting it in a turkey, I'm going to use a few eggs to help bind everything together. This is going to help give it a bit of a bread pudding texture, if you will. So I'm just going to pour my beaten eggs over top of my bread mixture, stir it all in until it's well combined. Then I can transfer this mixture to a baking dish, cover it with some foil, and bake it at 350 degrees for between 25 and 30 minutes. You just want everything to really set and become very flavorful. At the very end of cooking, you are going to remove the foil and let it cook for an additional 10 minutes. This is going to help you develop those beautiful crispy bits on top. In my house, the crispy bits are always the bits that people fight over. So I like to maximize the crispy bits if I can. And seriously, look how delicious this is. Don't think you have to wait to Thanksgiving to enjoy a stuffing like this. You can really make it any old time. And that is something to be thankful for. Next, I've got a deliciously decadent Southern take on stuffing that features cornbread instead of traditional bread, so you know it is going to be good. For this recipe, we are actually going to be using some breakfast sausage that has been removed from its casing, and that is going to be the sort of flavor base for this stuffing. If you want to leave the sausage out, you totally can skip this whole step and just use some butter in your skillet instead. Use the side of your spoon or spatula to sort of break that sausage into bits. Once it's just starting to brown and it's released some of its fat, you can add your onions and your celery to the pan. I'm going to cook those until they're nice and soft. Then I'll add my minced garlic, my fresh sage, and my fresh thyme leaves. After 30 seconds to a minute, let me tell you, those herbs, particularly the sage, are going to fill your house with such a gorgeous aroma. That means it is time to add your chicken broth to the skillet. We are going to season this with a little bit of pepper, but we will omit any more salt because of course that sausage is quite salty all on its own. And then we'll just heat this mixture up and let it simmer away for between 4 and 5 minutes, just till those flavors come together. Next, it is time to transfer all of that cornbread goodness into your skillet. Now, I am using some store-bought cornbread that I've just cut into cubes and allowed to dry out overnight. But of course, if you want to make your own cornbread, you can go ahead and use the recipe I've linked in the description box below. Always a great option. Cornbread's actually really easy to make, and I always make 2 or 3 batches at a time. We're going to stir that all around until the cornbread has soaked up all of that brothy tastiness. Keep in mind the texture of this is going to be a lot more crumbly than our first stuffing because the texture of cornbread is a little different than traditional bread, but it's still going to be amazing. Instead of stuffing this into our bird though, we are going to be baking it in the oven. So like I did in my last stuffing, I am going to add 1 beaten egg to it and just stir it in. We're just going to transfer this into a well-greased baking dish, cover it in a little foil, and get it into the oven the very same way we did our first one, 350 degrees Fahrenheit for between 25 and 30 minutes. Then you can remove that foil once again and let the top crisp up. This is Southern deliciousness at its finest. If you guys really wanted to take this right over the top, you always have the option to serve it smothered in chicken gravy. And if you want to finish it off with my easy breezy pecan pie, that would be really good. Finally, I've got a tasty treat for all of you gluten-free eaters who really miss the essence of stuffing. I am making a wild rice stuffing featuring some traditional holiday flavors, some cranberries and some orange. Really beautiful combination of flavors in here. This recipe starts once again with some butter melting in a skillet on the stove. To that, I'm going to add my onion and celery, saute them until they're nice and soft. Next, I'm adding my minced garlic, my sage. In this case, instead of thyme, I'm going to use some finely chopped rosemary, which is really beautifully complemented with that cranberry and orange. Once all of that goodness has become nice and fragrant, I'm going to stir in my long grain and wild rice. I love using the combination of rices here because I think it makes everything look really beautiful. After my rice has had a chance to toast up for just a minute or 2, I'm going to add my broth. In this case, I am using chicken broth, but if you wanted to keep this recipe vegan, you could definitely swap out the butter for a little oil and the chicken broth for some veggie broth. That would definitely work. I'm going to bring the mixture to a boil and then reduce my heat to low, pop the lid on my pot, and let this cook for between 20 and 25 minutes or until most of the liquid has been absorbed. At this point, we can turn our heat off completely and stir in the rest of our magical ingredients. So I'm adding the zest and juice of 1 orange, some lovely dried cranberries. Dried cranberries have just a perfect balance of tartness, but also a lot of really beautiful sweetness. Plus, they have great texture as well. Speaking of texture, we are going to stir in some pecans for a bit of crunch, and then a little fresh parsley, finishing it off with some salt and pepper. I'm going to give this all a stir, and it can either be eaten right away, or if you're making it ahead of time, not to worry, just transfer it into a baking dish, cover it with some foil, and then heat it up when you're ready to enjoy it. This is something you should feel really, really good about. Your gluten-free guests will be so thrilled that they get to partake in all the stuffing celebrations. And I like to think all 3 of these tasty recipes really sum up what stuffing season is all about. If you agree, be sure to tweet me, Instagram me, or Snapchat me a photo of your stuffing because of course I always love seeing your kitchen creations. Keep in mind, if you are looking for more great Thanksgiving inspiration, I have a whole playlist of recipes for you to enjoy, so you can take a look for those. And finally, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe because there is lots more deliciousness where this came from.